Yesterday was the first day of the Niners preseason game, and it was extremely challenging because the Niners just looked sloppy. Specifically, their offensive line and the offensive unit was under pressure a whole ton. But whose fault was it really? Was it all on Trey Lance? Or maybe was the offensive line just as bad as we think it's going to be this upcoming year? In this video, I hope to break down all of these questions and do a true deep dive into what happened in this game, specifically on the offensive line and the quarterback position. To begin, we need to look at the quarterback numbers and the grades of Pro Football Focus that were given to each quarterback, so we can just kind of understand if this was a quarterback problem or an offensive line problem. Starting out with Trey Lance. He was the lowest graded offensive player according to Pro Football Focus. On 27 snaps, he received a grade of 35.6. In comparison, Brandon Allen on 14 snaps received a grade of 90.2. Sam Darnold on 19 snaps received a grade of 73.7. So all these numbers definitely show that Trey Lance wasn't the best quarterback according to Pro Football Focus. There is more going on to the story right here, more specifically the pressure rate. So let's go ahead and break that down. According to PFF, the pressure rate for all the Niners quarterbacks was 33.3%, or 12 of 36 dropbacks. In comparison, in 2022, the Niners had a pressure rate of 23.2%. So in this game, it was nearly 10.1% more than back in 2022. But here's the thing, the offense line actually looked worse with Lance in comparison to the other quarterbacks. He had an insane pressure rate of 50%, being pressured on 10 of his 20 dropbacks. So while it's clear now that Trey Lance was pressured more than the other quarterbacks, being pressured at 10 of the 12 times in this game, it can't be all on him, right? Well, this answer is yes, it is on Trey Lance, but also no, it's not on Trey Lance. Let me explain. For example, on one of Lance's sacks, he had over 5 seconds to get rid of the ball. In comparison, the average I've seen floating around the league is 2.7 seconds, meaning Lance is definitely not being decisive and holding the ball for too long. This might be an indicator of his PFF grade. To further highlight how much more Lance was actually pressured than the other quarterbacks, he had a pressure rate of 50% as I mentioned, but once you take Lance's pressure rate out of the other quarterbacks' pressure rate, they were only pressured 12.5% of the time. Now, it's obvious it has to be on Lance, right? While I'm not going to say that Lance has no part in the offensive line's success, because quarterbacks really do, I am going to highlight now the offensive line's performance because they also didn't perform up to expectations. For instance, I want to go ahead and examine the pressures given up according to Pro Football Focus from Nick Zakelj, Jalen Moore, Leroy Watson, Matt Pryor, Corey Luciano, and Jason Poe. Starting out with some players that gave up the most pressures, Nick Zakelj didn't perform up to expectations. He had 4 pressures on 28 snaps. That's a pressure rate of 14.28%. But he was playing at right guard at the time, and in college, he played tackle. So it is kind of a different position than what he's used to. And while he's been in the Niners offense for now 1 year, it usually does take these guys a couple years to get fully entrenched as offensive linemen. For instance, during this game, I noticed that Nick Zakelj really struggled at anchoring and even was ran over a couple of times by the Raiders' defensive line. This is an indicator that his strength isn't up to par and that he really needs to continue to add strength and mass to be an effective NFL lineman. Now, moving on to the next player that gave up several pressures, Jalen Moore. Moore's been on the Niners roster for a while, but he was injured not that long ago, and I would say it could be possible that Jalen Moore still is dealing with some nagging issues. I'm not saying this is his only issue and he definitely needs to improve. I'm just trying to give a broader background to some of these numbers. While there were several other players that gave up pressure, there are 2 more players I really want to highlight in this section of the video before talking about the best offensive lineman on the day. And those 2 players are Leroy Watson and Jason Poe. I think both of these guys might have been some bright spots despite them giving up pressures. Leroy Watson last year was a tight end, he transferred over to tackle, and so far I think he's looked decent. Now moving on to Jason Poe, he even looks better than his rookie year. I know he gave up 1 pressure in this game, but he only had a pressure rate of 3.5%. That's extremely respectable. Now, moving on to the guy that I think was the best offensive lineman on the day, and Pro Football Focus agrees with me. That was Eli Manning. Eli Manning in this game was the highest graded pass blocker, which is surprising because he's an undrafted free agent that came out of Hawaii. He's only 6'2" and playing left tackle in the NFL. Many people thought that he would just be inefficient here, but so far, he really hasn't lost in training camp, and now it looks to be carrying over to the preseason. But exactly who is Eli Manning? He was the highest graded pass blocker in this game, but even in Hawaii, he was a dominant pass blocker. During his time there, he played in a total of 60 games. Only being 6'2", he was undersized, but dominated his level of competition routinely, giving up little to no pressures. The same can't be said in the run game. While he did move around effectively in college, it's not as effective as Kyle Shanahan's zone schema would dictate. He's not a guy like Trent Williams, who you'll see sprinting down the field, but he is extremely effective in pass blocking as demonstrated in this game. Okay, so it's nice to have a feel-good story about an undrafted free agent, but what are the chances he actually makes the team? And well, at the beginning of this year, I was unsure. I thought Manning might just be a practice squad player, but now with Nick Zakel's poor performance coupled with Jalen Moore's poor performance, it becomes a real possibility that Eli Manning can actually push for a roster spot. So with arguably the best offensive lineman out of the way in this game, we need to go revisit this entire offensive line and reconceptualize how they performed in this game, and if it was really all on them or Trey Lance, or really a mixture of both. To start this discussion, it's easy to blame one side versus the other. Trey Lance held on to the ball too long. The offensive line didn't do a good enough job blocking the interior, and they're both right. Trey Lance had a lot more pressures than the other players around him, such as Sam Darnold and Brandon Allen. While this can be argued that he wasn't going against the same level of competitions, with him holding on the ball around 5 seconds at times, that's not a good indicator of a quarterback making decisions rapidly. So with this highlighting of both the quarterback as well as the offensive line maybe not performing up to expectations, we do need to talk about the caveat here. All these players are players that hopefully will never see the field for San Francisco. Additionally, it's important to point out that if you take out Nick Zakel and Jalen Moore's pressure, the pressure rate for all the Niners quarterbacks would go down to 17.2%. That's less than their pressure rate allowed in 2020 of 23.2%. So while according to Pro Football Focus, the pressure rate is 12 of 36 or 33.3% of their dropbacks, several of these came from only a couple players. Now, if we remove those players, it does change the entire dynamic of the offensive line. I point this out because just because a couple of guys did have bad games, I think overall the offensive line, diving into their numbers and their actual performance, didn't perform as bad as would be suggested. Furthermore, there was actually a player that kind of stood out on the offensive line in Eli Manning, which is a surprise. So now that I gave my thoughts about the offensive line and this quarterback pressure rate that seemed insanely high to me, I want to hear your guys' thoughts down below. Am I maybe just being too optimistic about this offensive line, and is it time to freak out? Or what really stood out to you in this game? It would also mean a ton to me if you liked and subscribed. And as always, I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.